Okay, we could get started now, I think, and maybe some more people will trickle in, but we'll start. Thank you everyone so much for coming. My name's Jack. I edit the website phenomenalworld.org, and I'm thrilled to be here for this conversation today. It's co-hosted by N+1 and Dissent. We're going to hear Aaron Benanav, Tim Barker, and Katrina Forrester in conversation. The occasion of this is, of course, Aaron's truly excellent new book, Automation and the Future of Work, which is out on Verso on November 3rd, 2020, an otherwise unremarkable day in a totally normal year. The book is an elaboration on two essays that Aaron published in New Left Review last fall and winter, which generated substantial discussion both about the automation discourse, but also the determinants of sluggish global growth and deindustrialization and the prospects for social movements within the present global political economy. And I think the book should do more of the same. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce what I think will likely be the first of many productive conversations to come from this work. And I'm really, really pleased to have two brilliant historians and writers, Tim Barker and Katrina Forrester, here to discuss the book with Aaron. So I'll pass it to Katrina in a moment, but first I just want to strongly encourage everybody who's on the line, if you're not already subscribed to N+1 and Dissent, to please become subscribed today if you read the work that they publish and have the means. And you can go to phenomenalworld.org to get new posts from us every week or two. We send an email out with things we've been publishing. We publish widely across the social sciences. We have a new essay coming out tomorrow on data governance and a new piece by Tim, actually, reviewing Banerjee's new book, A Short History of Commercial Capitalism, in the next few weeks, which is great. And actually, finally, I want to please encourage everybody to buy Aaron's book. We have a code from Verso, who are generally offering half off to everybody who's at the event today. So we'll send an email out to all of you afterwards, and please click the link and order the book. Okay, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you especially to Katrina, Tim, and Aaron.
Thank you, Jack, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to do another set of introductions because I'm really delighted to welcome you all again to this event sponsored by N+1 Phenomenal World and Dissent, where we're going to be listening to Aaron Benanav and Tim Barker in conversation. So I want to just give a little brief introduction to Aaron's wonderful, invigorating book. Aaron's book is a really major intervention into current debates about how we should understand what has happened to work, how we should think about the future of work, and where current discourses about automation go wrong in their diagnoses and in the possible futures they predict and propose. Now, Aaron's an economic historian and a social theorist, for anyone who doesn't already know. He is currently at Humboldt University of Berlin. Automation, the Future of Work is his first book, but he's also working on a global history of unemployment, and his published writing on a range of problems about work, utopia, technology in EndNotes, New Left Review, and elsewhere is absolutely indispensable. And in this book that Tim and Aaron are going to be discussing, Aaron provides a really bracing critique of contemporary automation discourses, which predict the disappearance and the transformation of work. And he charts a fascinating alternative diagnosis through a wide-ranging history of industrial overcapacity, deindustrialization, the rise of the service economy, and global underdemand for labor. And in the book, he also critiques existing solutions to the problem. So those offered by left Keynesians, right libertarians, left defenders of universal basic income. And he points us instead towards a post-scarcity utopianism as a kind of critical horizon that we should struggle for as we try to move beyond this world of work to a better one. It's an invigorating book. I urge you all to buy it and to read it. And today to talk about it, Aaron is going to be joined in conversation with the writer and economic historian, Tim Barker. Now, Tim is, as we heard, also an N+1 contributor, Dissent contributor. He has written widely for New Left Review, LRB, many other venues. And he's currently working on a PhD at Harvard about military Keynesianism in the US and the political economy of military spending since 1945. So I've been looking forward to listening to this discussion for ages. And I know you all are too. So I'm going to hand over to them now to start off the conversation. And we'll take questions after they've chatted for a while. So if you have them, please put them in the Q&A and I'll try to collect them and bundle them if necessary as we go. So thank you all for joining us, and let's virtually welcome and congratulate Aaron on this important book.
Thanks so much. So now I speak, right? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, well, I prepared something just kind of brief to start us off and just tell you a little bit about the book. And I want to just tell you about how I thought about approaching the topic. Because in a lot of ways, I think of the book, in spite of the criticisms I make, as a love letter, as a kind of love letter to the automation theorists. I was myself raised in a science fiction loving household, like many of the people whose work I'm talking about. I grew up watching Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I hope it's not controversial to say that it's a much more important kind of world than Star Wars. And I read a lot of science fiction like Douglas Adams and Isaac Asimov, and all of that had a huge effect on me growing up. And like the automation theorists, I'm also really interested in how technology could free us from drudgery and from kinds of unsatisfying work. And I'm impressed by the effort of the automation theorists to imagine a world where that kind of drudgery no longer exists and people are free in all kinds of new ways. And as I say in the book, I think the automation theorists should be particularly commended for focusing on a kind of huge unsolved mystery in the world economy, which is that there's just not enough work to go around. There are too few jobs for too many people. This problem is already bad in countries like the US and UK, and we saw it achieve kind of huge new proportions during the coronavirus pandemic lockdowns. But this problem of a lack of work is actually much worse, of course, around the world in places like Brazil, South Africa, and India. So today we face a really extreme version of what's always been the core economic question. How do we explain the persistence of poverty and insecurity in the midst of rising wealth? The automation theorists have, I think, a pretty good answer to that question. They say we are just now kind of beginning or just have already passed a tipping point when machines, robots, and computers have become so hyper-productive and so powerful that they're displacing humanity at the center of production. And we're talking about things here like general artificial intelligence, machine learning, advanced industrial robotics, and kinds of new robots possibly entering the service sector. So in their account, they say we can work more and more, we can produce more and more, but with fewer workers. And the idea is that that's what's causing this big jobs crisis, or kind of slow burning, long lasting jobs crisis, both in the United States and abroad. And my book is an answer to that argument, although one that's posed again as a kind of friendly conversation and out of a deep respect for the kind of project that I think many of the automation theorists are trying to unfold. And I remain fascinated by the utopianism of the project, or the potential utopianism of this perspective. If it were true that people were having trouble finding work today because computers were taking over their jobs, then all we would have to do is replace the wages that those workers used to earn with free cash payments, or a universal basic income, a UBI, to solve the problem. So there would really just be a small kind of, but very significant institutional leap that we could take to enter a new kind of social world, which some of the automation theorists, and I take over this term, have called a post-scarcity future. So the problem with this argument that they're making is just that it isn't true. It's just not the right story for explaining this massive problem of too few jobs for too many people. It really is true, that is to say, that there is this massive problem of what I call labor under demand in the world economy. And I call it that because unemployment turns out to be a pretty bad way to think about what it means to experience low labor demand in the world today. It's not just unemployment, it's also underemployment and immiseration and a loss of autonomy at work and a whole range of other phenomena that just aren't captured when we talk about unemployment. And maybe we'll talk about that more today. So there is this big problem of a low labor demand, but the real explanation for this phenomenon is the opposite of the one offered by the automation theorists. We may live in a world of amazing new technologies. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that maybe these technologies aren't quite so amazing as advertised. And as I'm sure a lot of people saw, a big news item just a few days ago was a report that detailed the incredible rate of industrial accidents in Amazon warehouses, where it turns out human beings remain fundamental to that work. So that's one interesting problem, kind of engineering problem or a question about what's really going on with these technologies. What I can tell you definitely as an economic historian is that they're not producing or driving radical economic changes in the way that the theorists say that they are. Instead of living in an era of rapid investment in new plant and equipment, embodying brilliant technologies, what we're seeing instead is a dramatic slowdown. That is a slowing pace of investment and a slowing pace of productivity growth. The result has been not an era of extremely rapid economic growth attendant on the use of new smart and brilliant technologies, but rather economic stagnation and lackluster jobless growth. This trend has been long unfolding already in the advanced industrial and now post-industrial economies, but it's increasingly true as well in late industrializing countries like China. So the key argument of my book is that this radical economic slowdown is what explains the persistently low demand for labor in the world economy, and hence a lot of the poverty and insecurity that persist in a world of plenty. Given my alternative explanation, it's much more difficult to imagine a solution to this problem within the confines of perspectives, which is most of what we have today, perspectives that depend on reviving the economic growth engine in a stagnant economy. And that includes things from, as Katrina said, neoliberal structural adjustment, kind of right libertarian arguments about how to do it, new kinds of Keynesianisms and left Keynesian revivals, as well as the automation theorist's proposed perspective, UBI. I'm saying that in the world we live in today, these answers are going to turn out not to be adequate to the problem. They're not going to get us, as it were, to the post-scarcity world, the kind of promise that the automation theorists hold out. And I'm saying that I do actually think we can get there. We should revive utopianism today. We should have a perspective on how we can take this incredible productive capacity we have and produce a much better world for average people all around the world. So that's the basic argument of the book, is that it's kind of the opposite of what the automation theorists are saying, but we can still derive a kind of utopianism from looking at the economy and looking at the automation theorists and criticizing their perspective. After introducing this general framework of analysis, the book goes on to make a few interconnected arguments that fill that out, and I'll just say a little bit about that very briefly. So the book takes these two NLR articles and then divides them up into chapters and then expands that material by a full 100%. So it's really a lot more book, than the articles. But in the second and third chapters, I lay out this basic economic argument backing up my claim that the automation theorists have it backwards. So I start off by looking at the manufacturing sector, and I show that the job loss there is really output-led, as it were, rather than productivity-led, which is just to say that manufacturing is really shedding jobs due to a slowing pace of industrial expansion, not an accelerating pace of technological change. I explain how the incredible successes of global post-war industrialization generated the conditions in which further industrialization became harder to achieve. Worsening industrial overcapacity killed the economy's growth engine. As I explain in the third chapter of the book, nothing emerged to take the industrial sector's place at the core of the economy. What we got instead was slowing economic growth, low rates of productivity growth, and a massive financialization of the economy. Lots of money with fewer and fewer places to invest. A key argument that I make is that productivity growth only seems fast today because the yardstick we use to measure that growth, that is output growth, the overall rate of expansion in the economy, is slowing. Compared to the past, productivity growth is actually slower today than it was in the past. So the problem is our frame of reference in interpreting our world. Chapter 4 then turns to the consequences of worsening stagnation for working people. I explained that unemployment insurance programs were designed really for brief periods of cyclical unemployment in otherwise fast-growing economies. And I show that in the face of worsening economic stagnation, governments tended to reduce passive income supports for people who lost their jobs, so like unemployment insurance payments, and they turned instead to neoliberal labor market policies, trying to get the unemployed back to work, even if that meant pushing workers to take low wage and or precarious jobs. The idea they had was that eventually these jobs would improve with the revival of a faster pace of economic growth. But as I've already suggested, the revival of economic growth never came. And I show how these efforts to revive growth through flexibilizing the labor market played out differently in different regions of the world economy. So the US, other advanced countries, and then in the rest of the world. And then just introducing the idea in chapters 5 and 6, I look at the solutions to this problem. I talk a lot about the kind of automation theorist banner solution, UBI, universal basic income or negative income taxes. And I also consider an alternative that they tend to ignore, which is a revival of a radical Keynesian program. And I explain why I think both of these solutions are unlikely to work, because once again, they depend on reviving the industrial growth engine in a way that I don't think is really possible today. Finally, in the last chapter, I lay out an alternative vision of how to get to a post-scarcity world, which I hope we'll have some time to talk about today, but I'll leave that for the discussion. So I'll turn it over to Tim.
Great. Thanks, Aaron, and congratulations on your book. I'm really excited to be part of the conversation around the book's launch. I've been reading and learning from Aaron's work for years now, so it's exciting to see it in book form. And just to put my basic cards on the table, it's a great book. You should buy it. I found it so convincing in its major claims that at times I had to put it down and read some examples of the automation hype discourse, just because I had to check that it really was as outlandish as Aaron portrays it. And much of it is, I'm afraid, but we can hope that this book will go some distance toward clearing up a lot of the confusion. So I have some comments today to get us started. I'm going to start with some praise, and then I have some questions both about what's in the book and what's not. So I think the real contribution of Aaron's book is to put this contemporary anxiety about automation into a world historical perspective. Usually I find that when people talk about history in this context, they usually just say that there's been a long pattern of previous automation scares. And usually this is kind of a way of dismissing the idea that something could be different this time. People worried about, the car replacing the horse-drawn carriage, et cetera, and it's kind of, a minimizing rhetoric. Other people, the automation hype people, tend to take for granted that something really, truly unprecedented is going on. And I think the real strength of Aaron's approach is that he shows both that there is something new in the world today, but also connects it to a chain of events in the past. So he lets us see both the continuity and the rupture in this current wave of automation discourse and the reality that lies behind it. And another great strength is that for Aaron, world historical truly means world historical. He's always thinking and writing about the whole world workforce and population, which is, I think, both ethically commendable, but also analytically important in a discourse that is often focused on national economies or at most kind of generalized picture of rich countries like the United States and Western Europe. I've sometimes found when discussing the robot question casually with friends and acquaintances that the conversation ends up turning on how promising the participants find a given innovation. So how likely does everyone think it's going to be that they're actually going to make self-driving cars, in the next 10 years? So I was impressed in reading Aaron's book that not much of his argument really depends on that question. Though he has his doubts about the likelihood of certain innovations, he freely concedes that maybe we will see unprecedented breakthroughs in areas like the manufacture of apparel, footwear, and electronics, or those driverless cars. But that's not really the point. The point in the book is that the displaced sweatshop workers and truck drivers would not become permanently unemployed or become part of this sort of idle mass that haunts the imaginations of the Andrew Yangs of the world. Remaining unemployed is not an option for most people. The technologically displaced will become part of what Benanav calls the heterogeneous service sector, which for him includes informal work as well as wage service work that we're more familiar with in this country. Since almost 80% of the world's labor force is already in this sector, we don't need science fiction or futurism to imagine what it'll be like. It's already here. So the real question about our future is not whether some people will lose their jobs because of automation. They already have, and they will continue to do so. But whatever happens to manufacturing already concerns only a minority of the world's workers directly. So the question that Benanav rightly focuses on instead is whether anything can replace manufacturing as the engine of economic growth. His answer is no, and it must be said that the reasons for pessimism are convincing. While reading the book, I revisited the mainstream economist Danny Roderick, who has this paper on premature deindustrialization, which documents some of the trends that Aaron talks about, showing not only that industrial employment is declining around the world, but also that it's declining in poorer countries after having peaked at a lower level than it did in some of the earlier developing countries. And it totally blew me away how much of a blank Roderick draws when he tries to think about an alternative. He says at one point that services-led growth is a possibility, but he immediately undermines his own point, saying that only a few kinds of services are high productivity. And he actually includes finance in this somewhat dubiously. But he says that these high productivity services, quote, do not have the capacity to absorb, as manufacturing did, the type of labor that low and middle income economies have in abundance. So maybe someone has a better answer than this, but I haven't seen it yet. And I think this complete inability of the mainstream to imagine anything beyond a world of IT support, which even they don't really believe in, makes clear how important this book and its contribution are. I wanted to dwell on Keynes and the question of demand for a little bit, and not just because I'm, I think, probably more sympathetic to Keynesianism than you are, but also because, you know, to the extent that people read this book who aren't Marxists, many of them will be Keynesian or Keynesian curious. And so as I was reading the book, I sort of tried to think in my head how they would read the book and how they would react. The first thing to say is that any Keynesian picking up your book will see that it has a blurb from Lord Skidelsky, Keynes's biographer, endorsing it. So that's a good sign. And they'll also see that your utopia is, in certain respects, not so different from Keynes's, insofar as it centers on a radically shortened working day, which would create the freedom to explore existential possibilities beyond the realm of economic necessity. That said, the economic analysis centers on this problem of global overcapacity, which is an excess of potential supply of manufactured goods and also agriculture for some purposes. And here, of course, Aaron is drawing on the work of Robert Brenner and extending it to discuss deindustrialization. The counterpart to overcapacity is underinvestment. These two phenomena are the key to the stagnant world economy in the book's argument, and it works something like this. Businesses who already find themselves with idle plant will be reluctant to invest in new capacity. The resulting depressed levels of investment correspond to a general economic stagnation evident in the slowdown of GDP growth or output growth since the 1970s. Now, as the word suggests, both overcapacity and underinvestment are relative concepts. It's only in comparison with some other quantity that they have meaning. In the case of overcapacity, the relevant quantity is aggregate demand. Overcapacity exists when an economic unit cannot dispose of its full capacity output at a price they deem acceptable. I'm a little more confused about what the relative meaning of underinvestment is, but one way we could think about it is as a level of investment demand lower than what would be required to generate full employment. At times, it seems to me that Aaron uses these concepts, overcapacity and underinvestment, almost like they're absolute conditions rather than relative indexes of something lacking. So one of my big sets of questions is about the role of aggregate demand. Because Keynes features in the book, as I said, somewhat prominently, but mostly as the visionary of a post-economic future rather than as an economist himself, which would make him happy. One of the major points of the book is that the dismal record of productivity growth since the 1970s. But as low as productivity growth has been, real wage growth in many countries, including the United States, has been even lower. So most people's incomes have stagnated, not just because growth is subpar, but because there's been an upward redistribution of the fruits of whatever growth still remains. This wage repression, as one component of weak aggregate demand, is probably a factor in the slowdown of GDP growth. Post-Keynesian economists who would probably agree with much in the book would, I think, be puzzled by the frequent references to overcapacity not being complemented by a sort of parallel concept of demand efficiency. There are, though, suggestions of these demand dynamics in the book. For example, concerning the contemporary situation, Benanav writes, quote, "With little reason to expect the demand for their products to increase following the onset of a deep recession, few firms will undertake major new investment," close quote. We also read that more automation might have taken place in the last decade, except that, quote, "the demand could not be found to justify such investments," close quote. So it follows, I think, from this that an adequately large expansion of demand could lead to increased rates of business investment and therefore to some improvement in productivity growth. If this expansion were associated with higher wages, businesses would have a further incentive to automate where possible. And to use this example that Aaron uses in his book, the new gadgets that are on display in trade shows would actually find their way onto shop floors and become part of automating production. Our world would still be far from fully automated, but it might be a little bit closer to the world of the techno-futurists than the world we currently live in. So how realistic is such a scenario? Looking at the history of capitalism, we can say at least that it's happened before. Chronic overcapacity was a problem in American capitalism in the 1920s, even before the Depression made the situation much worse. Slowly and only semi-consciously, the New Deal and the Second World War provided new sources of demand that were powerful enough for business not just to return to high utilization, but even to undertake vast new expansions of their productive plant after the war. Around the 1958 recession, American businessmen again discovered that the problem of excess capacity had returned. But in the next decade, under Kennedy and Johnson, the stimulus of tax cuts and military escalation prompted another strong expansion. So therefore, I disagree with a historical claim that Benanav makes that, quote, "during the quarter century following the end of World War II, Keynesian countercyclical spending was actually little in evidence." He's correct to point out that public debt has actually been higher during neoliberalism than during the preceding era, which is correct. And also correct that many countries in Western Europe that we think of as having been Keynesian actually had fairly orthodox fiscal policies in the 50s and 60s. However, I think the importance of government demand in driving the post-war US economy should not be understated. In these years, government purchases of goods and services on an annual rate regularly exceeded fixed private investment as a share of aggregate demand, which was a pretty big transformation compared to the situation before the 1940s. Deficits were not as spectacular as they would have been, or as they would become under Reagan, but there were deficits reliably during every recession, and in the 60s, even when there was no recession. Even when government spending was paid for through tax increases, there was some effect on the economy through the balanced budget multiplier, and demand creation in the US also supported export-oriented growth in other countries. So West Germany, for example, was a beneficiary of this international Keynesianism, even though it did not embrace domestic Keynesianism until the late 1960s. Just because this is possible doesn't mean it would be desirable. And certainly these early instances of Keynesianism were based on the promotion of private investment, a strategy which had its own economic pitfalls in addition to political limitations. A more attractive option today would go further in divorcing investment from profit expectations by expanding the role of public investment. And this could be anything from the relatively anodyne infrastructure spending favored by Larry Summers to the more radical and thoroughgoing project of a Green New Deal. And I want here to recommend Aaron's recent review of a book by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis, which is in the latest issue of the New Left Review. There's a lot more in there on Keynes if you're interested in Aaron's thought on that. But I bring up the review here because it mentions something relevant. In the review, Aaron mentions, we already have an example of a state that was able to respond to the 2008 downturn with a massive program of public investment, precisely because it was able to invest without concern for profit, and this was China. It may be that in the years since 2008, that strategy has reached its own limits. But if, as Aaron writes, viable infrastructural investment vehicles have become harder to find in China, surely this is not true in the contemporary United States. That said, the contemporary ruling class is clearly incompetent and lacks coordination. It's very hard to imagine them implementing anything as coherent and farsighted as the post-1945 American rescue of global capitalism. We're currently witnessing an apparent political inability to pass a stimulus even in an election year, which would totally confound theorists of the political business cycle. But even without a grand recovery program, demand dynamics will play some role in shaping the fortunes of working people, perhaps not a big enough role to reverse the trends in your book, but something I'd be curious to hear you talk more about. How am I doing on time? So somewhat related to Keynes is the question of institutions, including the state, in the transition to post-capitalist society. I first encountered Aaron's work through the journal Endnotes, where he's an editor, and I've written about Endnotes for N+1. People should read it and subscribe. Readers of Endnotes will find plenty of familiar themes in the new book. Like the journal, the book is an exploration in post-industrial Marxism, where post-industrial is supposed to evoke rust belts and garbage pickers rather than shiny surfaces and leisure time. Like the journal, the book calls on us to immerse ourselves in political struggles as they currently exist, learning from their promise as well as their limits, instead of wishing that some other kind of struggle were taking place instead. But where Endnotes has often been scrupulously vague about what a post-capitalist society could look like, I found Aaron's book to take a more relaxed attitude about blueprints to the future. He even writes at one point that we need a vision of the coming world if we're not going to get lost along the way. And as I mentioned earlier, his vision of utopia is really organized around shortened work hours, equitable sharing of necessary labor, and free universal access to the necessities of life. There would be some role for regional and global planning, which would take advantage of new digital technologies, though as much of economic life as possible would be voluntary and decentralized. And I mention this because in its broad outlines, it's maybe less different than you would expect from the world that left futurists want. If we think about a book like For Futures by Peter Fraze, the major differences, I think, are Aaron's rejection of the UBI, Universal Basic Income, which has really suffered a reversal in fortune, I think, in the opinion market, which maybe we can talk about. So the opposition to UBI, and also Aaron writes movingly of achieving abundance as a social relation, that is a relation between people, rather than just a technological stage of development. So it's something that could, in theory, be implemented right now, rather than after we reach some threshold of automation, which you could call full automation, right, in the image of fully automated luxury communism. And then this is where I'll end up. The other major difference between Aaron and the other left futurists that remains is the role of class struggle in getting there. There's often a kind of technocratic sheen to the left futurist arrangements, but Aaron is very clear that it will only be through mass struggles that we get anything approaching his utopia, or perhaps even something as modest as a UBI will require big struggles. There's not much more than hints in the book about what these struggles will be, which is, I think, completely appropriate given that we don't know what they will be yet. But I was hoping we could talk today more about how you see contemporary struggles starting to build a path towards the society you describe in your book. And maybe also particularly about the class structure of societies characterized by this low demand for labor. You use at one point this image from the development economist W. Arthur Lewis of a dual economy, which he used to talk about the shift from agriculture into industry. You talk about a kind of reverse migration from industry into the low productivity sectors. And this is this dual economy idea has become increasingly common among other left economists. Lance Taylor, Service Storm, and Peter Temin have all made versions of it. And in some of these arguments, like Peter Temin's, for example, this creates a kind of class structure of 80% of people in the low wage sector against 20% in the high productivity finance, technology, and electronics sector. He's just thinking about the US there. I'm curious how you think about that, the kind of effects of the dual economy on the class structure and what that might mean for the struggles we see going forward.
I think, Aaron, do you want to take some time to respond? Thank you so much, Tim, for those amazing comments. And then we can go to more of a dialogue.
Great, yeah, that's those are really great comments, and I couldn't possibly respond to them all without like losing time for conversation. But I thought that was a really great reconstruction of like some of the really big questions of the text, and a really important response, especially on the Keynes and demand question, right? Which I think is something that, yeah, I'm just really excited to talk about more. And maybe there's a way for us to sort of like have more of a dialogue about it rather than me having a kind of extended response. I definitely think it's true that Keynesian stimulation is somewhat effective, right? And part of the argument that I'm making is that there's a bit of a a mistaken view on how things have progressed, especially since the 70s. And of course, it's an argument that you're very familiar with, right? Which is to say that the so-called neoliberal era is much more complicated than what a lot of analysts of it have described. I mean, one version of what's more complicated about it, which you see in theorists like, Quinn Slobodian, for example, is to say that the state has actually been way more important to neoliberalism than it's sometimes described, right? We live in an era that really is a strong state. Neoliberals saw the state as playing a really important role in creating markets, not just abandoning space to them. That's one kind of critique or adaptation or development of the thesis of the neoliberal era. But the other one, I think, is to point out that there really hasn't been an abandonment of stimulation, right, in this period. And in fact, as one of the graphs in the book shows, which wasn't in the original articles, and I think this is pretty well known by now, we've seen a really radical increase in debt levels in all over the world, really, but especially in a country like the US and across the OECD countries. And so part of the argument here is like, yeah, Keynesian demand stimulus is definitely really important in propping up the economy in an era of slow growth and overcapacity. But it's not true that we haven't been doing it. We actually have been doing it. And we've been doing it in all kinds of ways, from the kind of stuff that, Tim, you work on, like ideas about military spending and kind of military Keynesianism, Cold War kind of Keynesianism, to famously asset price type Keynesianism, QE, quantitative easing type stimulus. And we've seen, as you mentioned, in China and in other countries, right, way more of a kind of direct public investment playing a major role in driving up demand. And so the point that I make is just that over this period of radical increase in debt and radical kind of, a combination, as it were, of neoliberal and Keynesian responses to simultaneously flexibilize the labor market, push down wages, give capitalists access to low wage labor with fewer regulations on how to use it, and at the same time create all of this massive debt spending to create demand for the products, and with the idea that this will overcome. And I think in the Greenspan model, really like the boom within the bubble, that this kind of stimulus will get us to the new world. And I think that that's a reasonable read of what they were trying to do in Japan as well. And I guess that, like Perry Anderson, I have the idea that one should always needle the new Keynesians on not paying enough attention to the Japanese question, because Japan really did see the bubble as providing the context for massive new investments to raise productivity levels in Japan. And they actually did achieve that. But of course, it just made the problem of overcapacity worse. So that's really, if you think that, and in a way, this relates to 70s criticisms of Keynesianism that were made in the 50s by like Jacob, I don't know exactly how to say his name, Viner, as well as other kind of right-wing critics of Keynesianism. And then I think these were criticisms that Keynesians adapted themselves. The idea of structural adjustment, in my view, isn't really a neoliberal idea. It's a Keynesian idea about how to respond to overcapacity by switching onto a new growth track. And I think that what you see, as you mentioned, Tim, in your comments, is that you can have all this stimulus, whether it's through direct spending or bubbles, creating debt and all of these kind of things. But because there's nowhere to go, it's having, what we're seeing is declining returns over time to that process. So that's kind of the overall argument I would make about that. But I think that if you go into the details, there's a lot more to say about it. And I think the idea of states taking over the investment function, which is, the end game of this process, really just saying like states have to do the work, we can't rely on private capital, is an incredibly powerful and at the same time powerless political call in a way. I mean, yeah, we really should get beyond capitalism, but it's unclear whether we're going to be able to do that on the terms of a capitalist society. So I don't know, that's like my initial thoughts about it. I'm happy to talk about that more or to talk about some of the other things, but I think you're absolutely right that this is a really key question that I need to have a response to.
So
Thanks. I don't want to take up too much more time.
Oh no, sorry. I was about to say you should, Tim, do you want to respond? Otherwise, I could throw in a question, which is I would like to hear you, Aaron, talk a little bit more about the role of the state. Partly in terms of the discussion you've been having now about the historical role of the state and the potential role of the state, but also in your vision of the kind of post-scarcity utopia you point us towards. In part, and this is picking up on something Tim said, and I'd be interested to also hear more of what Tim has to say on this too. It struck me that you were in the book talking about utopia as a kind of blueprint more than a abolitionist or critical horizon. And I wondered what the role you rightly, as Tim say, leaves open the form of struggle to get there. But it seemed to me that the state, given your critiques of the Keynesians, might have more of a role there than I would have assumed from endnotes, for example.
Yeah, I guess, those are great questions, and definitely come back to some of the things that Tim said as well. It's very interesting. First of all, I would say that I would prefer not to describe it as a blueprint in a way, because I sort of think there's a great book. I was trying to remember the name of the author. This woman who was a Spanish anarchist wrote this book that's been republished by PM Press called Journey Through Utopia. It's a critical assessment of Western utopias. And she has a really great distinction, I think, between what she calls utopias of control and utopias of freedom. There are those utopians who sort of say, like, I can set up the perfect society. And it really means like they're going to explain what people are going to want, how they're going to want it, what their day is going to look like. And she's very good at explaining the kind of, particularly bringing out what they say about women in the stories and how often controlled reproduction is and what all of that looks like. And I think it's a very good critique that she makes. And then on the other side, utopias of freedom are really about asking the question, what are the structures that are just kind of, what are the foundational structures that would allow people to determine how they want to live their own life? Like, what are the conditions of us all being free together? How do we think about that? And I think that somehow, at least I hope that the second one is a little bit less like a blueprint in some way. I mean, maybe that's open to question. And I think that, maybe coming out of my past work in EndNotes, as you both have already said, I just think states are really bad and I'm really worried about them. And I have that kind of anarchist sensibility in me. That said, what's happened to me since I wrote this book is that, maybe like Icarus flying too close to the sun, I've now become burned by the socialist calculation debate. And all of my life now is just reading about the socialist calculation debate and thinking about what it would actually take to organize to meet people's needs in a post-capitalist world. And I think one has to be really humble about it. It's a really difficult question, and the role of central powers in doing that is a really difficult kind of problem to solve. So maybe I'll just say that for now, but we could talk about that endlessly. And I actually feel like the thing I haven't gotten to talk about enough in conversations around the book is the kind of utopian dimension of it.
Tim, do you want to come in there?
I appreciate the distinction between the blueprint and the utopia of freedom. I mean, I wonder if you'll indulge in, sort of just flights of speculation. I would love to hear more about the kind of global central planning that you hint at in the book. Or, can you say definitely what it would not be? Is there any more there than shows up in the book? Or is the book really as far as we've gotten in terms of thinking about that?
No, I've been working on this a lot over the past few months. So I actually have a piece coming out, hopefully in the next issue of Logic magazine, which I guess has a kind of relationship, a thought world, right, that it shares with both N+1 and Dissent, really, but is particularly kind of like the tech worker side of that triumvirate, or I guess you could say. And in the piece, I guess, just very briefly, and I mentioned this in the book, and I guess in a way the logic piece is sort of the appendix to what I say in the book. I guess, just put very quickly, a lot of socialists who became really interested in technology and planning became really fascinated by the idea of algorithms, linear programming, and basically like how really advanced computers, which they didn't have in Chile when they built Cybersyn, could now really crunch the numbers and generate the plan, right? We could just take a set of inputs about what people want, and we could generate the complete plan for figuring out what people should produce. And that might be one, you could fit that into the story that I'm telling, in which there's a realm of necessity and a realm of freedom. There's a realm where you have to organize to meet our needs together with one another. And then there's a world where people are much more free to kind of access resources and build all the other things that they want to get out of life. And I think that there's something really misguided about that algorithm answer and about the linear programming answer, because I think that there's a bunch of reasons why that it's often put alongside workplace democracy. It's like, we'll have workplace democracy in the algorithm, and the tensions between those two perspectives are actually really strong. Like, if we have this algorithm that works out everything that we're supposed to do, it actually leaves very little room on the ground for workers to kind of figure out the world that they want to make for themselves. And I think that one of the big problems, in spite of being someone really interested in work reduction, right, as you mentioned, it's really a vision in which the potentials of capital are resolved. The potentials of capitalism are resolved into a world where people have both security and free time. That's the goal. But by, as it were, kind of this linear programming perspective kind of takes the capitalist compulsion to economize, and it kind of forces us to maintain that pressure. And while economization is important, we actually want to live in a world where work is more enjoyable, where it's more sustainable, where it's more integrated potentially into the communities around the workplaces. There's a whole bunch of things that people care about that are actually going to require us to temper our interest or drive to economize. And basically the idea is that in order to do that, we need not only algorithms, but protocols. And I say that as someone who doesn't really know that much about computer programming. I'm only working with computer programmers, so I'm sorry to those who know if I'm really botching this stuff. But the idea is that a protocol is a structured decision-making process. So the idea is that we can use all these really advanced technologies to figure out what the relevant options are and to keep democratic decision-making within the guardrails that allow it to kind of add up. But actually these technologies, if you think about it in terms of protocols, like how people can make decisions together, rather than having a machine that makes all the decisions for us, you can build a different world. And again, it's really about the idea that instead of seeing this as a technical problem that we just need to throw our engineering skills at, we have to see it as a social problem and think about how technologies fit into the social world that we want to.
I'm glad you brought up Chile, because it's something I think the left spends a lot of time on Chile in a certain way, because of the American intervention, but I think actually we could use a lot more writing about the actual political economy of the Allende experience. And I've been reading about it, and it couldn't be more clear that their problem was not a lack of computing power. The problem was like a lack of control over economic agents, including not just big capitalists, but like many small, like bourgeoisie and truck drivers, and also lack of control over workers who were doing their own thing in the factories, which often worked against the sort of macroeconomic objectives of the Allende government. So I think it's definitely a clear illustration of this point you're making, and I totally agree. I was curious about tech workers, where they fit into your sense of this struggle, and I guess we'll be able to read more about this in your logic piece, but it's interesting because tech workers, maybe unlike service workers, work in a sector that still has some experience of change and progress, maybe less than we think, but more than if you're working as a garbage picker. So where do the people who still fit into those sectors, where do they fit into the movement towards your ideal society?
Great. Yeah. I mean, I should say, you know, full disclosure, both my father and my brother are tech workers. So I can't be really too anti-tech worker without causing a lot of strife in the family. And in fact, you know, I'm not in any way anti-tech. I think that there's a big issue which comes out more in the book than in the articles. It was just cut from the articles for space reasons, which is to point out, you know, something that Marxists have been saying for a long time, which is that technology isn't neutral, right? Like, it's not like technology just develops down some preset path, and it's just a matter of discovering the discoveries that are already there implicitly to be discovered. There's a lot more social, there's a lot more of society that goes into technological development. And I think this has become increasingly obvious to people with the mega monopoly corporations like Amazon and Google and so on. And so, you know, I think being really concerned about the world that big tech is building is not the same as being against technology's role in building a different kind of society. I would also say that, you know, something that was a common kind of misread of what we have tried to do in endnotes is to suggest that what we were saying was that like the garbage pickers are the new subject of social transformation and the tech workers aren't. And in fact, the argument we made there, which I still hold to and which is in the book as well, but I think, as you said quite briefly, is that the working class is just increasingly fractured within itself. It has people like tech workers, it also has garbage pickers, and many people in between. And we live in an economy where, and I think this is even more apparent in places like in Europe, where there's big struggles over precarity, where there's even more of a clear division, also in the rest of the world, between securely employed workers and really insecure and precarious workers. In the US, as I kind of talk about in the book, precarity tends to spread through the economy rather than being sort of localized in a sector. And we could talk about that more. But in any case, the point is that these struggles are therefore internally divided between these different kind of workers. And sometimes you see struggles like, I don't know, like the example of France or something, where there will be a big struggle against changes to the retirement age or something like that. And you'll have these old, you know, unionized workers fighting against these neoliberal reforms. And then those struggles will just be overwhelmed by huge numbers of precarious workers who have their own problems and their own reasons to struggle. And within the struggles themselves, you see these kind of problems emerging. And I guess, like, you know, I often make this caveat that I became a producer of ideas, and then I discovered that ideas are important, you know, and you should really take that with a grain of salt. Like, of course, someone who spends their time making ideas discovers that ideas play an important role in history. And we should, you know, we should be skeptical of that. But I guess what I do think, as I think was highlighted earlier, like, there has to be a vision of transformation. I think, like, people, one of the things that really distinguishes our era from the past, especially the late 19th and early 20th century, I think then that people really believed in socialism as an imminent possibility, both imminent in the sense of like one emerging out of capitalism and one that was very soon to be achieved. And that really drove a lot of organizing. It allowed people to find creative solutions within their struggles. And I think that one of the things that defines struggles today is often that they are defensive. And we know what we're against, but we don't know what we're for. And I think that, you know, people will often describe themselves as anti-capitalists as much as something else. They define themselves by what they're against, neoliberalism, capitalism, et cetera. And if they say they're socialists, it's not always clear what that means, actually, or communist or whatever it is. And so I think we need to revive that. And we really need to have a clear and coherent explanation of the kind of world we want to build out of the world we currently live in and how we can do that. And for some ridiculous reason, figuring that out today means resolving the socialist calculation problem. So that's what I'm working on right now.
And you mentioned the divisions in the working class, and obviously there are many of them. It also includes national and ethnic divisions. And I think it's subtle, but I think an important takeaway of your book is that in this world of low demand for labor, there's a really high risk of hatred and scapegoating of people who come and take our jobs, right? So this new socialism would also have to have some way to articulate the commonality within all that difference against a background of not enough jobs for everyone.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's important to distinguish between trying to have a positive vision of the future and being optimistic about the future, right? Those are not necessarily the same. I'm hoping that we can be more optimistic as there's more struggles and they're more organized and more powerful, hopefully, in the future. But there's a lot of reasons to believe that workers really won't be able to coordinate themselves, that they'll remain divided along the lines, as you said, and that will prevent the emergence of a more positive, emancipatory future.
I'm keen to bring in audience questions here because we have a lot. There are a few different bundles, I would say. There are a bunch on utopia, so I think I'm going to park utopia for a second and come back to that, and pick up on some of the questions about technology and capital. And so one of the questions about technology is really, I suppose, might fit into this more pessimistic reading of what's going, well, our future, pessimistic reading of our future, which is really to say, what does technologies at the moment threaten workers' capacity to strike, workers' capacity to organize. And so how do we think we should struggle given that reality, and how can we get towards a utopia given that reality of the ways in which technology is used in oppressive ways? We've talked about some of the other ways of technology is used. And I also want to kind of bring in, actually maybe I will bring in here some of the questions about utopia. And there are a couple of questions that people want to know a bit more about how you think about the limits of UBI, Aaron, and what the specific comparative advantages of the alternative utopian vision you favor are. So maybe we could start off with that, and I'll come back and bundle a couple more in a minute.
Great, yeah. So really important questions. You know, when I think about technology stopping workers from organizing, I have this image at the beginning of the book, just mentioned in a list of things that might be happening. You know, military grade robotic dogs like marching across desolate plains. And definitely, you know, in the past, major social transformations have always depended, in the end, on soldiers, like everyday people who make up armed forces, not being willing to fire on protesters. And, you know, in a world where people are facing down not, you know, people from their neighborhoods and villages, but rather like an army of robotic dogs or like Terminator style machines, you know, clearly that's a very different kind of thing. And that is a scary possibility. And who knows whether things like that will happen and what kinds of struggles will be possible in a world like that. I don't think that's where we are today. It's certainly true also, I should say, that a really important part of what's going on, and I'm not the first person to point this out, is that technologies, you know, the same companies that are kind of being heralded as having all of these incredible technologies, I mentioned Amazon before, they're also really investing in surveillance technologies for their own workers, right? So using technological capacities, they kind of sometimes say, oh, their warehouses are going to be automated, but they're investing a lot of energy into surveilling and tracking the workers who do actually continue to work in very large numbers in those warehouses. So, you know, you could talk about a range of kind of technological developments that have made it harder for workers to organize because there's a lot of surveillance, because there's a lot of misinformation. But I guess I would reject the story that says that technologies are sort of mostly bad. I don't know that we really have the evidence for that. I think what we've seen is that in a world where people are massively urban, much more literate, more educated, more connected to one another in new ways, that can be bad a lot of the time. Like we all know social media is really alienating, but there are also all of these possibilities for people to come together really quickly. And I'm not myself, I don't work on this topic, but people I'm close to have said that just in sheer number of participants, the struggles in 2020 in the United States, by number of people participating, were just much larger than any that have happened before. Like the actual number of people who went to protests was just truly enormous. And I think it's hard to imagine that happening without the technologies we have. So in a way, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Like there's a lot of possibilities for organizing. And while it's true, I think that what we haven't seen yet is social energies, confrontational spirits, and technologies and new ways of thinking about organizing sort of crystallizing or catalyzing into a new form or forms or whatever of organization. I think we haven't really quite seen that happen yet, but I hold out hope that that will happen and that it really will empower people to change the world. On the limits of UBI, I think, you know, there's a really long version of the story and a shorter one. I'll just say briefly, I talk in the book about all the positive things about UBI. And I think particularly in America, where the welfare state is so racist and means tested, it makes so much sense to look to universal benefits as a way forward and having these emancipatory possibilities. I think as well, you know, when we look at poorer countries and think about how to put put money in the hands of poor people without a very complicated infrastructure of, you know, welfare distribution, it makes a lot of sense why people look to that. And, you know, any effort to reduce poverty is something we should be in favor of. Like in the midst of COVID, the US had the worst response in some ways institutionally. All these people lost their jobs. They were scrambling, trying to figure out how to get benefits. But in the end, a lot of people, as was, you know, widely reported, they because of the federal subsidy to unemployment benefits, poverty actually fell in that moment because they finally put some hands in the money, put some money in the hands of poor people. I should say I'm doing this from Berlin, so it's actually quite late here in the evening. I probably will mix up more words as we go on. But in any case, on the limits of UBI, it's really a distributional project. And that means that it just ends up suffering from the limits of all distributional projects in an era of slowing growth. So what we've just seen is we've lived through an era of massive welfare state retrenchment. And I don't buy the argument that that's simply because bad politicians took control of things and, you know, set us on that path. As the economy slowed down, it's just become harder to fund a growing welfare state. And funding a growing welfare state often means taking purchasing power out of the hands of more higher income workers to try to put them in the hands of lower income workers. It kind of accentuates a lot of divisions in the working class. And I don't think that UBI will really overcome that. In essence, my argument is that in order for UBI to be this really positive emancipatory pathway, it has to be the case that the automation theorists are right. It has to be the case that production, there's no problems with production. The economy is becoming more and more productive. All these amazing new technologies are being implemented. And it's just a problem of distribution, how to get money, purchasing power into the hands of workers. My argument is that there really is a problem with production. The economy is slowing down. It's harder to fund projects like that. And that means that we have to have a plan for transforming production, not just distribution. And that requires us to think not just about wages, but also about capital. And a big problem with the UBI is that it really focuses on how to change workers' incomes, not how to change how investment and all these kind of things happen. A lot more to say about that, but I'll leave it at that for now.
I have a quick thought on the surveillance, which is just that, you know, this is obviously this is a historian speaking, but I think that, you know, the technologies of surveillance today might be new, but the fact of kind of like overwhelming boss surveillance, you know, has happened at lots of time through history. And often in kind of, you know, company towns or mill communities where it was like very hard to escape the gaze. If you go and look in the 1930s and look at how much companies were spending on labor spies to try and keep out unions, it was huge. And still at some point, even faced with that and faced with physical coercion, at some point, enough people trusted each other enough that they kind of organized in the teeth of that. So I think that that basic dynamic isn't different. I also think the 30s experience can speak to the question about leverage and how workers don't have leverage once they've been expelled from industrial production. we think of the 30s as the heroic age of the industrial worker, but especially early on in the 1934 general strikes, unemployed workers were organized and were a key part of the success of citywide strikes in places like Toledo and Minneapolis. So I think that there's some lessons there probably about organizing in times of low labor demand that the left would do well to revisit.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So there are so many questions, and I'm going to just try and collect some of them again. So there are a bunch of questions that ask you to say a little bit more about your critique of Keynesianism. There's some that ask you to clarify your relationship or how committed you are to Brenner's thesis. So I'll put those here as the kind of governing. And then there's a question that I want to read out because I think it gets to where you ended up in that last question, Aaron. And I think you also talk about this in the book. It's from Nick Mulder. So my question is about how the future of work in relation to the future is how it relates to the future of capital. It seems we're seeing a growing trend in which better futures have all accepted the omnipresence of capital, and instead of arguing for its redistribution, think the best we can achieve is a universalization of its returns in the form of universal capital endowment, public trust funds, etc. Even among critics of inequality, Milanovic, Piketty, Blythe, this is now dominant. How does the end of scarce capital affect your view of a post-scarcity future? And we can come back to another bunch of them in a minute. I think it's probably enough for you to get on with.
Great. That's really interesting. And I think that, I read, as I was working on the book, I read Daniel Susskind's book, which is called maybe A World Without Work or something like that. And I was really interested to find that although many of the themes kind of repeat from other automation texts, he really sees UBI is not enough. And he talks about the need for something like a universal capital income or something like that as well. And I think it's really interesting that people are thinking about that and thinking about the investment function and what it would mean to have more participation in it. I guess that, to me, what all of that misses is how important dispossessing workers is for the whole structure of our society. People really do, like the whole thing is based on a really strong degree of managerial decision-making power, which is itself limited by profitability considerations. And managers are able to make decisions about what the most profitable pathway is because they can mostly force their workforces to submit to those plans and say, look, it's, you either do this or you're fired, or we're going to have layoffs, or we're going to close up shop. And so I think that there's a kind of, there's a real problem, which I want to write about more in the future, with solutions that imagine that we can keep society more or less as it is, but give workers enough resources that they basically don't have to go to work anymore. Like they would be able to walk away from the system. And I think that that contradiction really unfolded, gets you to see the limit of all of these distributional ideas. That is to say, we would actually have to change the way we organize production in order to implement plans like that. So we would need a more radical program, basically, or the program would be pretty minimal. And like UBI, it could just be part of a more unequal world. Like if it's not radical enough, it'll end up just being a kind of ersatz welfare state that I think will just be part of a world of inequality. And it's just so easy to imagine, small UBI payments in a world that just doesn't really look that, or small capital payments or something like that in a world that doesn't look that different from ours. Should we talk about, I'm happy to talk more about Keynes and Brenner and stuff like that. Cause I also, I got into a very small mini debate with like Pseudo Rasmus, who's like such a huge figure in the econ Twitter world. And I've been thinking a lot about what he said and how to respond to it. So I'm really kind of invested in figuring out these Brenner Keynes questions. So yeah. So was there more to that, or should I just riff on what I imagine it says?
I can read out the questions if we want the specifics, why not? So Nathan Parker asks, my understanding from your NLR essays is that you follow Robert Brenner in attributing the decline in profit rates and therefore growth rates to heightened international competition that lead to system-wide overcapacity. a view that deviates from Marx's explanation for the tendency for the rate of profit to fall in Capital Volume 3. Brenner has received some criticism because of this, most recently from Paul Mattick Jr. in his Theory as Critique, who argues that heightened competition only speeds up the generalization of the profit rate while it's still the rising organic composition of capital that independently lowers it. What is your view of this critique? And I guess we could bring in the Keynesians now, although I think that's probably enough to get on with for a second. Aaron, do you want to just take that question?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's good to be, I always like to be in a place where I can be criticized for being like not Keynesian enough and not Marxist enough at the same time. That's like a good place to be. And I really, it's true that like Brenner, I'm very agnostic on the like ultimate questions about the falling rate of profit being an inbuilt tendency. And maybe one of the advantages of being an economic historian is that you get to lean a little bit on the historian's desire to like say what happened and not totally theorize exactly why it happened. So I'm really interested in those questions, and I don't know that I have a particularly good response to them. I will say that a big difference between what I'm saying and what Brenner says is that I think that my story, and this comes out a little bit more in my dissertation, which I intend to turn into a book down the road, but also in the book that's coming out, it's a more structural story in which I pay attention not just to manufacturing, but also to agriculture and to services. So on the one hand, part of my argument is that a lot of the reason why Brenner has a story in which there's too much entry, there's all of this entry into industry, in spite of it already being oversupplied. And I think the only way to really explain that, why that would happen, ultimately it's not going to be like it's not just about a kind of Marxist organic composition story. It's really a story about de-agrarianization, exit from the countryside, and the fact that agriculture actually faces much more intense problems of oversupply and overcapacity than industry does. So there's a lot of reasons why countries have tried their hardest to break into industrial supply chains. And I think that's left out, as it were, in Brenner's account, which just focuses on 3 high-income countries. I think the other problem with that account is that it doesn't really say enough about what Brenner calls the non-manufacturing sector rather than the service sector. And my account really relies on Baumal's argument about low productivity services to give a more structural account of what's going on. So I've always been really interested in, I guess my core idea from when I started getting into all of this stuff was that a lot of the Marxists I read, they were so scared of famously mispredicting like 7 of the last 2 Great Depressions or whatever it is that people say, right? That they kind of went for a much more cyclical theory than a structural one. And I was really interested in making a Marxist, as it were, structural theory of economic change. And I thought the way to do that was to look at sectoral structural changes in the economy. That is to say, the shift from agriculture to industry to services. And a lot of the debate is about how to think about that change and what it really means. But I really think that, I guess, that whatever the logical coherence of the organic profit rate falling story is, it just can't really capture what we're talking about when we're talking about the modern economy. And that requires us to turn to a number of other theorists, particularly people like Keynes and Baumal and Schumpeter and Kaldor and all of these other thinkers to try to understand how the economy has developed since Marx's time. I'm obviously, though, deeply inspired by Marx's project, and there's a lot of ways that I'm trying to bring out that idea of the growth of the surplus population and the kind of long-term tendency of the system to generate surplus populations and immiseration. So in fact, let me just say, I mean, that's also crucial to my critique of Keynesianism, because I think that, and I read a lot about Keynesians in the 70s and think about this transitional moment for this project on the global history of unemployment. And I think that Keynesians too just do not pay enough attention, as it were, to these structural dimensions of the economy. And I think, it's surprising when you read Keynes and you just see how little he has to say about those issues, it makes complete sense that Keynesians in the 70s were saying, look, if we stimulate demand, we can push the structural transformation from the old high growth industries to a set of new high growth industries. On their perspective, you would just assume that such industries exist to be discovered. But if it's just not really true that's there, it really transforms the possibilities for a Keynesian project. And it is actually, as I try to always emphasize, much more like the story Keynes himself actually tells, in which there's a structural tendency to arrive at a capital post-scarcity world in which there's so much productive capacity that it drives the marginal efficiency of capital down to such a low level that you can't get full employment without significantly reducing the work week. In a lot of ways, I am inspired by Keynes's account of a liberal socialism. And I could say more about that. But in essence, I think it's very important to think about how people who don't like socialist societies can get their hands on printing presses and print big, newspapers about why socialism sucks and why we should all be Max Stirnerite anarchists or whatever. Like those possibilities for people to get a hold of resources and do with them what they will, which I think is not really part of a centrally planned vision. I think those were things that Keynes was interested in. Anyway, that's like a longer story, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Tim, do you want to jump in?
No, let's get more questions.
Okay, so I think this kind of flows a little bit into some of the questions about maybe your the difference between the ideas you're putting forward and the kind of endnotes articulation of communization theory. And maybe if you could speak to some of those differences. In particular, it does seem, a couple of the questions note this, that, that there was a rejection of the logic of implicitly state-mediated planning there. And that, it sounds like you're not going that far towards that rejection here. So could you speak to that? And then I think at the same time, maybe also bring in another question, which is about, in some sense you spoke to that just now, but I wanna read it out. So to clarify, does Aaron believe that the problem with Keynesianism is that it works too well, promoting growth and thus exacerbating overcapacity? Is the utopia he envisions a zero or negative growth economy? If so, this seems to clearly distinguish his views from the Keynesians and those of Keynes himself. And so kind of more on these ideas.
Okay, great. No, I continue to think that the state is mostly just a power for dominating people and that there's not really potential there. My point is that I think that a lot of the traditions that I sort of come out of on the radical left, which are very obscure and weird, and I don't expect a lot of people to know about it, but I've also been surprised how over the last 10 years, like, all these people are talking about councils and Bordiga and anarcho-syndicalism and all these things that I think of as incredibly marginal and embarrassing interests that I have, although I think they're really important historical traditions. But I think that what you'll find is that a lot of those traditions, they focus on the problem of work. They see the solution in terms of workplace democracy, and there's a real difficulty of figuring out how a lot of workplace democracy adds up to a coherent social formation. And I think that in a way, thinking about the socialist calculation problem has just really stressed to me how hard that problem is to solve. But I am interested in thinking about how precisely new kinds of computer technologies, thought of in a different way than in the kind of algorithmic techno-utopianism of a lot of the automation people, but also other kinds of digital socialists, how we can actually use these technologies to build a society that looks a lot more like the one that, doesn't have a central power actually, and that in which people do form federations and are able to solve a lot of their problems that way. So that does remain my real interest, but I've come to understand it as being a harder problem to solve than I had initially kind of expected. And maybe requires some math that I myself don't possess, but the workers have the math, so it's going to be okay in the end. But yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm interested in talking about it more. The other one, just remind me, because I apparently didn't write it down, was just the topic. was.
Very Keynesian. How growth.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's really interesting. Like I have so many friends who got deep into the Green New Deal train, and I find it really interesting how the Green New Deal has obviously moved from being a clear kind of program of the Bernie presidency into being a much more open question of what a transition looks like to a post-fossil fuel world. And I guess that I think that the debates that are about growth, no growth, and degrowth are slightly misplaced, because I do think that like growth as a metric is something that we should criticize. And I think one of the important things of the degrowth movement has been to kind of try to bring that out, like how useless GDP is as a measure of social happiness, basically, and social and freedom and all of these kind of things that we're actually interested in. And we'd be better off trying to think about how to solve the climate crisis, provide people with security and freedom. And I think that we can do those things. And what the effect would be on some nominal measure of growth that someone could place on our solutions is actually a lot less important than the debate about those things seems to describe. Obviously, a transition to the kind of world I'm talking about would have to be very fundamentally about overcoming or transforming the energy system so that it's no longer based on fossil fuels. And that means building up all of these kind of renewable resources. It also means dramatically reducing meat consumption. It means giving back huge amounts of land to the regrowth of forests and rewilding huge amounts of territory. All of those things are really important. But I think that there's something odd to me about describing that in a kind of austerity, as an austerity project, because we actually need to create a world in which people have security and freedom to do a lot of the things that they want to do. And of course, a lot of the biggest polluters in the world are giant corporations and very wealthy people. And there's a lot of that wealth is just going to have to be confiscated. And a lot of the things that they spend money on is just going to have to disappear from the world. And so how that will all look when you add it up in aggregate terms is less important once you disconnect people's security from having a job. So that's the start of an answer. I mean, these are really complicated questions, so I'm just giving my best shot.
Great answers. So there are a bunch more. I'm going to throw some of them out so that you can decide which to take up, because we don't have that much longer left. One is kind of provocative. What is the point of a vision for a post-scarcity utopia without a political organization to fight for it? So I'll just kind of leave that there. And the others are there are two questions that invite you, Aaron and Tim, to carry on conversations. And so I'll throw those out too. One is about a direction you were going in at one point, Aaron, when you were talking about precarity. And the question is, how has the American system spread precarity? And perhaps invite you to go back to some of the questions that Tim raised about class structure as well, I think, in his comments. And the other was to talk a little bit more, and I'll just throw this out there in case you want to pick it up, about Japan and the limits, what that reveals about the limits, the case of Japan reveals about the limits of Keynesian tools, but also just in general to talk a little bit about perhaps some of those practical limits on Keynesian reforms that I think you speak to in the book as well.
Yeah. Great. Let's see. Well, lots of great stuff to talk about there, actually. What is a vision of the future without an organization or a party that can realize it? Yeah, I mean, we have to figure those questions out. And clearly, I think a lot of the ideas about organization from the past are not adequate to our present moment. But I think that generally, my view is that the kinds of organizations that people need to carry out their struggles tend to emerge organically within those struggles themselves. And so, maybe that, I'm sure that answer is not really exciting to people who want to kind of revive different kinds of, Leninist or Trotskyist kind of visions from the past and kind of import them into the moment. But I think it's as yet an unresolved question, and one that I'm really excited about seeing the answer to in the future. On the question of Japan, let me just take a moment, and I'd be really curious what Tim thinks about that. I find it really weird that when Keynesians are talking about what's happened, they just don't talk about the Plaza Accord and the Reverse Plaza Accord. I mean, it's like oftentimes when people read Brenner, they make it a story just about the United States, and the way that it's a story about what's happening in these different regions and how seesawing the world economy is, and how all countries don't actually go through the same patterns at the same time. That's a fundamental, important insight of that analysis. And I find it frustrating that in other accounts, you often see a distinction between rich countries and poor countries, or like highly developed and developing countries, but you don't see an analysis that can explain why there was no ICT tech boom in the early 90s, basically, in Germany, let's say, like can't really explain those phenomena. And it's because they just don't pay attention to the seesawing currency values. They just don't see that there's a period after Bretton Woods ends when the dollar radically devalues. Then between 79 and 85, it revalues. And then from 85 to 95, it really, really, really radically devalues. And then it kind of moves back up after that. And those seesawing currency values have huge implications for global finance, for the fates of Germany and Japan as major competitor powers, for the rise of China and Mexico, for the explosive Asian financial crisis. And I just don't think you're going to be able to give an account of what happened without being aware of that. And I find it very frustrating how that just doesn't enter into, basically, unless you're Richard Koo, unless you're giving an economic account of Japan, it tends to not be a part of the Keynesian project. And I think it does present a lot of problems for that perspective, for a variety of reasons. And one which Tim mentioned is just that basically late developers, it's not really Keynesian, right? It's much more about centrally planned command heights of the economy and forcing a huge increase in savings to promote a gigantic rapid pace of investment. It's kind of the opposite of the way that Keynes imagines, and the kind of story that Tim, I think, very rightly told about what was going on in the US, and how little that model works when applied to other countries. So I don't know, maybe that's me expressing some of my frustration about the Japan thing more strongly than I have in other contexts. I'm curious what you think about that, Tim, and then I could say something about the precarity stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm far from an expert, so I'm reluctant to say too much. I think I tend to think about the Japanese experience kind of as evidence for my view that if something like Keynesianism were going to work, it would require more thoroughgoing kind of regulation and planning than people have typically thought of. And particularly a big part of what happened in Japan was that the result of these currency movements that you talked about resulted in like a big asset bubble, right, in Japan, and then the busting of that bubble is what precedes like the lost decade. So I think you need some way to like to wall off the stimulus from just creating credit bubbles. Although we know that that was like intentional policy, in the United States at a certain time. So my prediction about the future is if that kind of thing were to work, you'd need some kind of more thoroughgoing, like qualitative credit controls than we've had. Japan also has problems, increasing their labor force, which is related to attitudes about immigration and gender and various things. So that would be another big variable that we could get into. But.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I also, I want to say on the Keynes thing, like, I want to face off against really strong interlocutors. And I always recommend that Keynesians read, I'll say it again here, and I talk about it a little bit in the book, but Beveridge's book, Full Employment in a Free Society, is like an incredible book. And it's really strong. I mean, I don't think it's right, but wow, what an incredible vision of possibility. I think that basically people pay too much attention to American interpretations of Keynesianism and not enough to British, really, I will just say British Keynesianisms, which I think in a lot of ways are stronger and more interesting, and even European Keynesianisms in a way. And so I think that that conversation could be productively developed in that direction. I still think it doesn't work and that it's not enough and that there's a lot of reasons why. And, you know, Keynes himself, when he read Beveridge, he was like, yeah, this is all fine and good, but like, what about the global economy? I mean, you just don't talk about the global conditions for something like this to be possible. And of course, you know, those conditions really weren't great for Keynesians. And when Keynesians wrote this text, I think is very interesting. It's called National and International Measures for Full Employment in 49. It was like one of the first UN texts. It was just laughed out of the room. It was considered completely ridiculous and had no chance of being implemented. So anyway, thinking about that, on precarity, which I think is really also an important discussion and debate, I find it very odd. There's certain American theorists who have reacted to the use of the term precarity by pointing out there aren't really that many precarious workers in the US. And it's very strange to me because it has to do with not really seeing the differences between class structures in other advanced countries and the US. So the thing about the US, and I think this should be pretty well known by a lot of people, is that there's at-will employment. And that just means that there's really no such, like the word in the international labor statistics is permanent jobs. Imagine what that means, permanent versus temporary jobs. What is a permanent job in America? Basically, like tenured professors have permanent jobs. Like no one else has a permanent job. It doesn't mean anything. But in other countries, it's so crazy to imagine this. Most workers, they can't be fired at will. You can't just dismiss someone once you've hired them. It's way harder to get rid of workers after you've given them a full-time job. And so in Europe and Japan, if you have workers who have full-time permanent employment, you have to change the legal framework of employment. You have to find ways to expand the workforce that doesn't have a permanent right to the job that they hold. You have to find all these temporary part-time workers. You have to create all these different structures in Germany, where I am now. It's a very important one called a mini job, was originally designed to create tax-exempt, like part-time work status for the wives of securely employed union workers, and now it's used by many other people. And you know, so in countries with this non-at-will employment, they've had to create all of these different precarious job categories. In the U.S., all workers except tenured professors and private, you know, we might say private unionized workers. And the unionized workforce has dramatically declined, obviously, in the private sector in the US. So a lot of the protections unionized workers had aren't shared by other workers. In the US, most workers are precarious in the European sense. So there are reasons why employers want to hold their workers at an arm's length distance, like Uber, platform economy stuff. You see all these forms of subcontracting, but it actually plays a less important role because more workers are just exposed to labor market ups and downs in the US than in Europe. Like if you have a permanent job in Europe, you're much less exposed to the rise and fall of the unemployment rate because it's harder for your employer to get rid of you. And so what I do in the expanded version of the chapter about this in the book is I really try to explain that we should think about workers' protections. One way to think about it anyway is in terms of the degree to which workers are exposed to labor market trends, you know, in their economy. So like in the US, where workers have fewer protections, they're way more exposed to a low labor demand economy. When the unemployment rate rises, they become very unsure about their job status, whether they'll be able to keep their jobs. And it has an incredible wage depressing effect across huge parts of the US economy, not just low skilled workers, but college educated workers, all the way up to like the 80th percentile of workers find it really hard to fight for better conditions. Their autonomy is dramatically reduced in a low demand economy. Permanent workers have much more power, even when unemployment is high, because they can't be fired. And of course, that exists too in a lot of other countries in the world, where workers in government jobs and industrial factories in a lot of global South countries also have very strong protections. It's just that the informal workforce is so enormous that securely employed sector tends to be much, much, much smaller. So sorry if that's a little confusing, but that's the big idea, is that in the US, precarity spreads very widely because very few workers actually have this kind of security of employment that exists in other advanced capitalist countries. In other advanced capitalist countries, they've been fighting for decades to dramatically reduce the number of workers that have that special protection. So I hope that's clear.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. We've been going for 90 minutes. Tim, do you want to come in with anything? Do you guys will have like final thoughts before we wrap up?
I don't know what I can add to what we've already said.
Well, I'll just say, you know, thank you guys so much. Like, thanks to Tim and Kat, and thanks to N+1 and Dissent, and Phenomenal World, of course. And, you know, please, like, as I said, the book is hopefully, it's discounted for those of you who are here. I hope you find it interesting. It's a lot longer, not too much longer though. It's still an incredibly short book, but it's longer than the articles. I think I fixed some of the issues in the articles and expanded the arguments there, so it's worth checking out. These are really difficult, interesting questions, and I'm really glad that my work can, you know, help provoke some interesting conversations like this. So thanks again, really, to Tim and Kat and to all the teams involved. It's been really fun to talk about it. And I feel bad I ended on a kind of pessimistic note about precarity, because the point of the book is at least to try to inspire, if not optimism, at least a sense that amid the kind of unfolding clusterfuck of the world that we currently inhabit, we can really start to, not just start, but enhance our capacities to think about what it would mean to get out of it, what it would take to get out of it. Because I think that no matter how bad things get, in fact, you know, really dramatic change sometimes comes out of periods that appear initially to be relatively hopeless. And so, you know, that could be the era that we live in now.
And I'll say I didn't find reading the book depressing, which might be surprising given the subject matter, but testament to your success.
Yeah, great. I'll also say that, you know, the word I used to introduce it was invigorating, and I think it is an invigorating book. So we all need some invigoration right now. So go buy it, read it, be invigorated. Yeah, do whatever comes next. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dissent, N+1, Phenomenal World, Lisa, Jack, and everyone. And please buy Aaron's book. And thank you all for joining us. And thanks for the great questions as well.
Great.